Okay, this is Mr. Schwenke again. We're going to continue our studies of evolution and its background by looking at some of the ideas that Charles Darwin, who we credit as being the, quote, father of evolution, end quote, he had other people who went before him in science and gave him some of the ideas that probably came together in his head, unlike they'd had in other people's. So, ideas that shaped Darwin's thinking. The Earth is quite old. I think most people anticipate that the Earth is much older than they are, and there's history that goes back to some thousands of years, but in the times when these guys were around, they didn't really have records that went back to millions of years. They didn't have geological dating. They didn't have the complete studies of fossils and things like that. Excuse me. But they did have geology. So some people who were helpful for Mr. Darwin were a couple of people named Hutton and Lyell, and they looked at geological change. Hutton and Lyell helped scientists recognize that the Earth is many millions of years old, and that the processes that changed the Earth in the past, such as erosion and raising or changing sea levels and things like that, are the same processes that operate in the present. That's actually a pretty significant statement. And some people didn't agree with that, but that's what science is all about. Okay, there's a set of beliefs called uniformitarianism. That's a big word, like supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, sort of. The theory that Earth's features are mostly accounted for by gradual, small-scale processes that occurred over long periods of time. Maybe you have a bookshelf in your house that gets dusty because it's near a window or the air blows around it, and if you dust it off someday and get it clean, then come back a few weeks later, there'll be dust on it again. If you let it go for a long time, there'll be a pretty thick layer of dust. And if you could let it go for hundreds of years, the dust would basically be several inches deep. We don't see that happening because we wouldn't have a shelf there that long, and we probably wouldn't let it go that long. But anyway, the processes are small-scale processes that occur over long periods of time. 1795, this is well before Mr. Darwin's trip. 1795, James Hutton published a hypothesis, in other words, a set of beliefs that he believed in about the geological forces that shape the Earth. Many of these geological forces operate very slowly over millions of years, such as erosion or deposition. If a river flows into a lake, the speed of the current slows down, and any sand or stuff that the river is carrying, which can be carried in the fast-moving water, will probably be deposited quickly after the river flows into the lake because it slows down and the particles sink to the bottom. So, things like that. Hutton proposed that the Earth had to be much more than a few thousand years old. And that picture on the bottom is the Grand Canyon, and that's an impressive place. I've been there when I was a kid. Maybe some of you have been there. That's erosion by a river that you can see in the very bottom of this picture, right down here. That's the river that eroded this cliff all the way down to where it is now by flowing. That looks like it would take some time, and that's what it says here. So Lyell's principles of geology, that scientists must explain events in terms of processes that they can actually observe. We can observe erosion, and we can observe deposition, but there's some other things that are hard to see in our lifespans. The processes that shaped the Earth millions of years ago continue in the present, just very slowly. Lyell's work explained how geological features could be built up or torn down over long periods of time. And this understanding of geology influenced Darwin because he thought that life itself may develop very slowly over long periods of time, just like geology. If the Earth could change over time, life might change as well. That's a good analysis. It would have taken many years for life to change in the way that Lyell suggested, and he wasn't a biologist. And this would have been possible only if the Earth were extremely old. And of course the word extremely might mean 6,000 years. We actually think the world is about 5 billion years old. A billion is 1,000 million, and so that's pretty old. According to another person named Lamarck, how did species, in other words, we're talking biology here. So Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, obviously of a French origin, recognized some things. Living things have changed over time. They based that on studies of bones and skeletons of living things from hundreds or thousands of years ago, some of which had turned into fossils. All species were descended from other species. That's a pretty powerful statement, and he didn't really have a whole lot of proof for that, but that's what he was proposing. It's a hypothesis, remember? And organisms were adapted to their environments. That makes sense. If you look around, organisms that we see every day are adapted to where they live. And that's why if we get changes in the environment too quickly, the organisms may not be so well adapted. He proposed that by selective use or disuse of organs, in other words, parts of their bodies, organisms acquired or lost certain traits during their lifetime. These traits could then be passed on to their offspring. Over time, this would lead to a change in species, at least in terms of how they look. And he also had a theory that all organisms are tending toward perfection. That's kind of a strange way to say it, that they all will be as adapted as possible to where they live and to how they live. So they have an innate or built-in tendency toward complexity and perfection. They are continually changing and acquiring features that help them live more successfully in their environments. This is a little strange because it's like you want to be a good runner, so you practice a lot and your legs grow 2 inches longer because you like to run. We know that doesn't really work. Maybe you can make the muscles stronger, but you can't change it too much. So his hypothesis is a little bit over the edge here, but it's a good step forward. He proposed a picture of a giraffe trying to eat leaves from a tree. Giraffes are vegetarians, and if the giraffe can stretch out its neck, then he'll be able to get to the branches and eat and be successful and grow up and reproduce and all those good things. And so as the giraffe continually stretches his or her neck, it'll be longer and enable this giraffe to eat more. But this is in one individual, one organism. And obviously this might rule over generations, but to have this happen to one organism is a little bit hard to take. But it's a theory, or it's a hypothesis. There's a thing called a fiddler crab that uses its front claw to ward off predators and attract mates. And his hypothesis was that this crab is going to use one of its claws more than the other in the front. It's got a match set, like you have two arms, but it uses one or the other, usually the one on the left side, as the crab would view it, and it gets bigger. And he says because the claw is used repeatedly, it becomes larger over the lifetime of the same crab. Now, the crab molts, and when it molts, the shell dissolves and it forms a new shell, so it's conceivable that that could form a larger shell over the claw, and maybe this could happen. And we do see the crabs with large claws. So that's an interesting thing. And that claw, that then could be passed on to the generations, to the offspring of this crab, and they would start with a larger claw. Seems a little awkward to have that, but it works for this crab. So, inheritance of acquired traits. Lamarck thought that acquired characteristics could be inherited. They didn't really understand inheritance or genetic structures or DNA and RNA, any of that good stuff, or Punnett squares, but they knew generally that children would have some tendencies to look or act or be talented like their parents, and that would be an acquired characteristic. He believed that if an animal acquired a particular feature in its lifetime, the feature would be passed on to its offspring, or could be. And they were interesting, but they're incorrect in several ways, as we know now, but people back then didn't really know how to evaluate them. Lamarck did not know how traits are inherited. I just said that. They didn't understand the process of genetics. That an organism's behavior has no effect on its inheritable characteristics because they're already set in the DNA that organism has. However, he paved the way for later biologists. So oftentimes one scientist will say a lot that's right and some that's not quite so right, but it helps build on the base of knowledge for future scientists in that same area. That's still going on today. Okay, we had a person named Malthus. This one's a little depressing. Malthus said basically, here's a graph on the bottom, if we have a population that's doing an exponential curve, and with the virus going around now, we've heard lots about exponential curves, how something can grow slowly at first and then grow quickly later. And populations do that. Populations of viruses, populations of bunny rabbits, populations of people. If there's unlimited resources, they can grow really quickly. However, resources, food, water, air, all that stuff, is generally more linear, like a straight line like this. And so there's some point here where the growing populations are not above the resources that can support them, which would be the black line. And then where they cross that line, meaning they're using all the resources that are available at this point, and here they would be looking for more resources than are available because the line is below them. So anyway, he had kind of a depressing theory that noted that babies were being born faster than people were dying. The only forces he observed that worked against this growth were war and famine, which means hunger, and disease. So he said that if the human population continued to grow unchecked, sooner or later there would be insufficient living space and food for everyone. And back then there were less than 1 billion people on the earth. Kind of strange, because now we have, I think, 7 billion. When Darwin read Malthus's work, he realized that this reasoning applied to plants and animals. If all the offspring of almost any species survived for several generations, they would overrun the world. That'd be true for earthworms or rabbits or palm trees or humans, but we're not faced with that situation for many reasons. This information was central to Darwin's explanation of evolutionary change. Okay, again we're stopping, and the next section, section 3, will be a little bit more wrapping these two things together. Let's do this quiz real fast, see how you did. Again, I'll show the thing, and we can read through the answers and see if you can figure out what the answer would be, and then we'll look at it. Hutton and Lyell recognized that geological processes of the past differ from those of the present. Probably not. Indicate that the Earth is many millions of years old. Probably. Operate quickly over thousands of years. Well, they may operate over thousands of years, but probably not quickly. And always involve violent events like volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods. No. Erosion is really boring. And if you like to study plate tectonics and you know that a particular plate is moving 2 centimeters a year, you'd have to stand there for 10 years to get a 20 centimeter movement. You know, it's slow stuff. Which one of these makes the best sense? I think it's A. Oh, I said that wrong. Indicate the Earth is many millions of indicate that the Earth is many millions of years old. This is not true. I wasn't thinking back. Did you get that one right? Okay, discovery of many fossils challenged the idea that acquired traits could be inherited. Earth is many millions of years old. Well, the fact that Earth is many millions of years old would probably support this fossils. Species had never changed over time. No, that doesn't support it, because you can see fossils from different depths showing different characteristics. Geological changes are slow. So, which one do you think? I'm not going to tell you this one. Come on, choose one. And E is not a choice. Okay. Species had never changed over time. I think they all agreed that that was taking place. Which of the following scientists proposed the hypothesis of selective use and disuse? And that was in the reading more than the PowerPoint. Basically, it's sort of like use it or lose it. And if an animal doesn't use a particular part or function of its body, then over generations, that piece or that function will disappear. Think about your little toe. Your toe is part of a structure that used to have the toes fairly even in size millions of years ago. And toe is very important for balance when you're standing or running, but your big toe and the ones that are long do that. Little toes are kind of really not very important. And maybe in 10,000 years, people won't even have them. We'll see. So, what is the hypothesis of selective use and disuse. Choose one. Okay, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And the scientist that proposed if the Earth is shaped by geological forces that took place, that proposed that Earth is shaped by geological forces that took place over long periods of time. Who is this guy? Malthus was the resources and population. Darwin was evolution. Hutton or Lamarck. Probably one of these guys. Choose one. Okay, Mr. Hutton. And I think this is the last question. Darwin's reading of Thomas Malthus made him realize that because of overpopulation, human beings cannot avoid extinction. That's pretty drastic. All living things must evolve. Living things produce more offspring than can possibly survive. The basic ideas of Lamarck were wrong. Which one do you think? Well, think of Finding Nemo. Finding Nemo, the original movie, and they had produced the eggs and they were hidden nicely, and they had hundreds of eggs, and then the nasty eel broke in there and ate all the eggs except for one. Why would you have to produce 100 eggs? Well, in the hopes that some will survive. If you've ever seen a movie of or watched turtle eggs hatch on a beach, maybe they get marked off by the state's biological protection areas. I saw these in Florida once, and as the babies start to hatch, they'll put a fence around it and protect them. But of 100 little turtles that try to crawl toward the ocean, maybe half of them will get there because birds swoop down and pick them up and eat them. And then of the 50 that get into the ocean, probably 40 or 45 of those guys will drown because they don't really know how to swim. So we get 5 out of 100. That's why we have such large populations. And even though 100 and 200 years ago, human families would produce more children than they thought would really survive due to illness and whatnot. So pioneer families might have 7 kids with the hopes that 4 or 5 of them would live to adulthood. That's kind of grim, but that's the way it is for most organisms. Okay, we'll stop there, and we've got one more section to do, which we'll do on Friday, I believe. Take care and be careful.